I'd like to now go to our last speaker for today before we have the break, a question and answer break, and then the next session. I'd like to invite Guillermo Ortuño Crespo to please come and give your talk.
All right, let me try to figure this out. Who would say I'd do this for a living? All righty, can you see the screen?
It's saying it's starting to share content. It's not there yet.
I don't like it, but just make
yeah. Just make it bigger.
Okay. Yep. Okay. Well, I'm getting some messages that you can see it. So, well, thank you very much to IMBeR for this very generous invitation, and congratulations for such an ambitious and well-executed event. My name is Guillermo Ortuño Crespo. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Center, and I'm going to be presenting some work that I did while completing my PhD at Duke University on considering indigenous peoples and local communities in governance of the global ocean commons. And by global ocean commons, I mean areas beyond national jurisdiction of the high seas. Before I get started, I also want to point out that this manuscript is open access in the journal Marine Policy, and that I am just one of many co-authors of this research to try to better represent all the stakeholder groups that should have a say in how the other half of our planet is managed. So for those of you who may not perhaps be as familiarized with the high seas, they represent almost half of the surface area of our planet. They are 64% of the 71% of our planet that is blue. And they're areas that lie beyond the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone that each coastal and island nation have around the world. And I think the conversation of marine spatial planning has really developed within those 200 nautical miles, and it's really been lagging in the context of the high seas. There have been some papers like the one on the bottom of your screen that was published over a decade ago now, sort of introducing the concept of marine spatial planning in international waters, but it really never really gained traction given the institutional complexities of the high seas and the difficulties of managing these shared waters. So I wanted to contextualize this talk and give you a sense of who is out there in the high seas and what sectoral activities have really taken off over the last 70 years. In the panel up top, you can see how oil and gas exploration, deep seabed mining, the laying of underwater cables has increased almost exponentially over the last 30 years. The panel on the bottom shows what I consider to be the largest stressor on the open ocean right now, which is commercial fishing. And we've seen a tremendous increase in fishing effort, these areas in dark blue, over the last 20 to 30 years. And what is very worrisome is that in light blue, since the mid-1990s, we see that landings haven't really kept pace with the increase in fishing effort. So there is evidence to suggest that we are putting too much pressure on these systems. Over the last few years, we've been much better at trying to map where these cumulative impacts are in the high seas. The figure up top is from a 2015 study by Halpern et al., where we can see change in cumulative impact over time. And then there are many areas of the high seas which, in the warm colors, where we're seeing quite dramatic increases in cumulative impacts as fishing increases, and so does maritime shipping. The figure in the bottom shows vessel tracking data from a group called Global Fishing Watch, and that shows non-fishing vessels with these transponders, as well as fishing vessels. And we can see that humans are essentially using the high seas across all latitudinal bands and across more than one ocean sector. So the conversation about marine spatial planning, even though it hasn't really started in the high seas, there is evidence that perhaps we should be having these conversations about cross-sectoral management a bit more. I'm a marine spatial ecologist by training, and I think about how and where we can establish protected areas and no-take areas to preserve the composition and integrity of marine systems. And in the high seas, it's unfortunate that these two figures pretty much capture all the marine spatial management that is taking place in the high seas right now. On the left, we have some of the deep seabed mining claims that have been established by the International Seabed Authority. So I don't know if these would be conservation or management areas. And the figure to the right shows some of the existing area-based management tools in the high seas, predominantly fisheries closures. We're missing the raw sea MPA down in Antarctica, but this is pretty much what we have out there for pelagic and benthic fishing in half of our planet. So we're quite far behind any type of marine spatial plan in the high seas or effective cross-sectoral management. I am not an expert in marine spatial planning, but this is my perception of two of the sort of basic ingredients that we need in order to even be able to start the conversation about cross-sectoral marine spatial planning. And one of them is access to reliable spatial temporal information on not only the distribution of the stressors, so the human activities, but also the biological communities, the biodiversity in the ocean. And the second key ingredient is bringing the right people together. And I think that's particularly hard in international waters. It's a part of the ocean that is dominated by a very select and small number of players. And perhaps, well, I believe that not all the key stakeholder groups are being included in the conversations. And that is something that we try to address through this manuscript. Just to give you a sense of what our understanding is of biodiversity in the high seas, this figure represents the known biological diversity in the high seas as reflected by OBIS, which is the Ocean Biogeographic Information System. And this is a snapshot of the best available information we have for biodiversity in the high seas. It's about 23,000 species, and the map looks pretty well covered. But if you look at the legend down in the bottom, any pixel that is in light or dark blue represents a 100 by 100 kilometer grid cell for which we only have 1 to 10 species record in the whole historic series. And any pixel in white represents a pixel, an area of the same dimension for which we essentially have no biodiversity information. So it's really hard to start the conversation about cross-sectoral management when we're working with this type of data and this poor resolution. If we zoom in briefly to, let's say, fish, for instance, this is the distribution of this biodiversity information under OBIS. And again, it's very hard to start a serious conversation about cross-sectoral management of these more than 4,000 species if we're working with this baseline data. So I don't think the conversation on marine spatial planning is going to start anytime soon in the high seas. But if it were to start today, we were to host the first meeting today, I think these would be the only players that would really take part in the conversation. So like the companies that engage in underwater cable laying, the International Seabed Authority, large fishing nations, and large maritime shipping nations. And what makes the conversation so difficult, the marine spatial planning conversation so difficult in the high seas, is that each of these sectors is essentially siloed in the United Nations. The figure on the bottom left shows a schematic of the approximate structure or architecture of bodies in the UN. And these organizations really don't speak to each other as much as they should in order to engage in cross-sectoral management. And so one of the issues that the UN is trying to address right now is this lack of mechanism to establish cross-sectoral management measures. The Law of the Sea Convention that established national waters and international waters does not explicitly call for the protection and conservation of high seas biodiversity, nor does it create a mechanism to establish cross-sectoral management measures such as marine protected areas or marine spatial planning in the high seas. So the UN is now gathering this moment to negotiate a treaty that would create a mechanism to establish cross-sectoral spatial management measures. And one of the topics that has been raised by a few nations over the course of the negotiations is this concept of adjacency and the importance of acknowledging the connectivity, both ecological and cultural connectivity of the high seas to coastal communities and coastal ecosystems. Because whatever activity ends up happening in the high seas, we now have the evidence that it will have a negative, or it has the potential of having a negative impact on our coastal systems. So we put together this policy brief a few years ago to introduce the concept of ecological connectivity and the importance of acknowledging this connectivity to preserve species of cultural or spiritual importance. And within the first day, I can assure you that the big fishing nations in the room shut it down. They did not agree that any coastal nation or any coastal people should have any more say of how the high seas should be used by anyone. And they invoked the high seas freedoms that are sort of defended in the Law of the Sea Convention, and to essentially argue that what they were doing is right, and that the legal claims that we were making were not substantiated. But we have continued to persevere in this topic, leaning on the evidence of transboundary ecological connectivity out there. For the non-experts in the call today, there's two types of transboundary ecological connectivity. We have passive or planktonic connectivity, and this is essentially ocean currents transporting larvae and eggs and nutrients across jurisdictional boundaries. And the one that is most relevant to this publication is nectonic or active connectivity, whereby species through migration or straddling movements cross jurisdictional boundaries and connect the high seas to coastal communities, coastal ecosystems, economies, and cultures. And we were, in this manuscript, we married this concept of tracking marine species across jurisdictional boundaries with a database of the most up-to-date database on the distribution of coastal indigenous communities and peoples around the world. And we focus on 4 case studies to demonstrate that, in this case, leatherback sea turtles, salmon, fur seals, and albatross that are important to some of these coastal indigenous communities engage in really large migrations across other countries' EEZs, as well as the high seas, and that whatever happens to these species in the high seas will have not only ecological and economic, but also cultural impacts back home within the coastal ocean. So the twofold objective of this manuscript was to sort of support and provide evidence to defend the rights of coastal indigenous communities to have a seat at the table at these UN negotiations, which are predominantly led by nations who don't always, in some cases they do, but they don't always defend these cultural rights.
1 minute left.
Thank you. And also demonstrate that it is possible to use new technologies to identify areas of high risk in the high seas. So we know that there's almost 1,000 migratory species that engage in these type of transboundary movements, and many of these have some type of cultural or spiritual significance for coastal communities. And so essentially what some of the conclusions that we reached is that, well, the evidence shows that the ecological status of some of these animals is quite worrisome and threatened by high seas activities. That the integration of animal tracking and traditional knowledge can help identify relevant stakeholders within the coastal ocean and advance the conversation of cross-sectoral management in the high seas. That the high seas freedoms that some fishing nations and maritime nations hold on to pose a challenge to transboundary management. We hope and we'll keep fighting that, so that the BBNJ text for this new agreement acknowledges the importance of monitoring transboundary impacts and bringing the right stakeholders to the table. And I think that the conference of parties that in theory would emerge after the treaty is complete would be an appropriate or good way to engage coastal indigenous communities in the implementation of the treaty. Thank you.
Thank you